Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of 21st Century Korean Screen Culture series that's hosted by the Center for Critical Korean Studies here at UCI. For those of you who are actually joining us from maybe even outside UCI, um, this event is being held in conjunction with several other departments at UCI, Department of Asian American Studies, East Asian Studies, Department of English, and Film and Media Studies. I thank everyone, including I see Mike Saleh, a chair of English, who is very gracious enough to actually render support for this event, as well as Julia over at Asian American Studies, Huing East Asian Studies, and Fatima, which chairs also at Film and Media Studies here at UCI. And I'm so excited to welcome two of my friends in the entertainment industry. And I thought it was a great opportunity to actually mix the two together. One veteran, seasoned veteran, Charlotte Ko, and just a newbie. Who's just starting out. She just graduated from our UCI, the famous drama department with an MBA just last spring, I want to say. Right, Charlotte? I mean, right, Crystal? They're both C's, so I get their names confused, although obviously I've been friends with them for some time now. Welcome to the event, Charlotte and Crystal. I hope your evening or afternoon is going really well. And so sorry that we obviously have to do this, over Zoom, non-contact period that we're in. I think a lot of people, as you mentioned a little bit earlier, are zoomed out, and so, but we see quite a few people who sent in questions and have decided that they want to come in and see what the conversation, how this conversation is going. Charlotte is a Chicago native media executive and producer who is actually one of the founders of Hulu Originals that I sometimes watch these days because of the pandemic. She has produced Emmy-nominated scripted and unscripted television, Oscar-nominated feature films, digital social video, and audio storytelling companies such as Hello Sunshine, Marvel, GoPro, HuffPost, and Searchlight. Her projects have included in the past China with Reese, that's out available through Netflix. Another Netflix show, Get Organized with the Home Edit, The Awesomes, uh, Hulu, East Lost High, also at Hulu, The Last King of Scotland. This is an independent film with Searchlight. No Sun Scandal, also with Searchlight. She now teaches at USC School of Cinematic Arts, Peter Stark producing program, where she earned her MFA. She also holds her bachelor's from Stanford University. And Crystal is, as I just said, she's one of our alums. She's from Philadelphia. She is now a Korean American actor based in LA. She received her bachelor's degree from Brown University, and she also studied classical acting at, I'm gonna have to just guess what this is, LAMDA in London. She's a lover of both theater and film, is devoted to Asian American representation in all of media. And I have to say that she stars in a play that I wrote and I've produced. It was formerly called Pandemic, now it's called The Masturbate, which is coming to Illumination's YouTube site very, very soon. We're just putting the final touches on the sound edit and we'll be able to release it. So take it away. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Kyung. Thank you, Kyung. Hi, Charlotte. It's so great to talk to you again. So I guess my first question is, how are you doing in the pandemic? How are you holding up?
Oh, I can't complain, really. It's obviously been inconvenient, but there's been a lot of work that has been possible remotely. So it has been a surprisingly productive time in some ways.
Awesome, amazing. And like Kyung said, I'm just a newbie. I'm just entering the industry. So from my perspective, I'm like, how does Charlotte Ko become Charlotte Ko, this huge media executive? So I guess could you speak a little bit about how you got to where you were?
Oh, yeah, no, and I would say big media executive is a nice way of putting it. Well, where do I start? So first of all, I should say I'm like the only child of Korean immigrants who very much were, diehard Confucian value people who really hoped that I would be a lawyer and, bring respectability to the family. So after college, I really struggled to sort of figure out what to do because I had the privilege of having a great education, but I had no idea what to do with the education in a way that was going to be fulfilling to me, as opposed to just like checking all the blocks of like what everyone around me was like, well, that's a good idea. So I ended up being a management consultant, which eventually I managed a transfer to the London office. So I lived in London in my early 20s. And while I've been very passionate about theater in high school and college, and really the kind of weird avant-garde stuff, as opposed to like the more classical Shakespeare and, Ibsen and that type of thing, I ended up consulting for MTV Europe. And this was like a really important project for me in retrospect, because it made me understand that there are all these other jobs in the entertainment business that have nothing to do with acting, writing, or directing. And I didn't really understand that until I was inside a television network and I can meet all these different people who are working on everything from, choosing the programs that are going to get made to designing the MTV logo at the time. I mean, this is the late 90s, so MTV in Europe is relatively new, and they're experimenting with a lot of different brand identities. And at the same time, one of my college friends had dropped out of medical school to go to film school and get a degree in producing. And he was like, you should do this. And so I applied to the program, got in, and the great thing about the Peter Stark program is that it actually places you in an internship. And I knew I really loved independent movies, which kind of makes sense given I was into like avant-garde theater, that I would love indie films. And the 90s were kind of the peak of that kind of taste. So I went to go work at Searchlight as the intern, and then I ended up staying there for almost 7 years and really learning the business in terms of like how to read scripts, how to talk to talent. I went to all the major film festivals, how do distributors look at acquiring movies. And after that, I ended up doing a couple more years in the film business at Marvel and some independent film financing. And then it was the early dawn of video on demand. And I was very interested in the intersection of like technology and content creation, because I felt like it was very difficult to make a lot of great content if you didn't have a sustainable business model. You always need the money. The money need was never going to go away. And when I was at Marvel, we had licensed an old animated TV show to Hulu, and I could actually see the checks coming in, and I could actually see like, oh, this model could sustain premium content based on where they're headed. And I got recruited by somebody who was working at Hulu at the time to come in and start original programming, because there's no one in the company except like software engineers and MBAs. Like there was nobody who actually had a producing background, because at the time Hulu was just a place where other people's content went, but they didn't like make anything. And then that got me into the hard pivot into television and digital types of media. So since then I've had all these other jobs that are basically at the intersection of the two. And then the most recent one, I worked for Reese Witherspoon's company for 2.5 years. And there I ran like everything other than her scripted television business. And it had to do with direct to consumer brand building. So like her book club, unscripted television, audiobooks and podcasts, all the social media channels, the YouTube channels, all that type of thing. So it's been a funny path, because I think I kind of planned it only one job at a time, if that makes sense. And it was kind of like, where is there growth? Because when there's growth, there's opportunity for a new person to like accelerate and like, have a big role relatively quickly.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, just hearing about your journey, it feels like you've lived multiple lives already. I'm curious, I guess along the way, I'm sure there it was like a roller coaster. There were bumps, really great ups and really, bad lows. And all the while you're Korean American. And, it's really rare to find other Asian Americans, especially Korean Americans in this industry. Can you speak a little bit how you navigated that path, a path that is not a traditional one for us?
I mean, it was really hard. I'm not gonna lie. Like, my parents were very disappointed when I went to film school. And they didn't really, I don't know. I think they didn't want to not be supportive, but they had a hard time being supportive. I think there was always this glimmer of hope that I would like give up and go to law school. And I think the hardest part was like the assistant years when I felt like, well, I don't know if I'm ever going to be an executive. And I'm almost like 30 at that point, and I'm still somebody's secretary, which is, in our business, it's very common, right? You started at the bottom. It doesn't matter if you have an MBA from Harvard, everybody starts at the bottom. And then I think being a woman and being a Korean American, it's not like today where things like K-pop and Parasite and Minari and even things like Fresh Off the Boat, which is just an Asian American representation, or Crazy Rich Asians, but there's like more respect, I think, in Hollywood for what Asian American and Korean American storytellers are bringing. Whereas when I entered the business 20 years ago, not only did it seem impossible to me that, we would distribute a film that was not primarily featuring white characters, it also seemed impossible that like we would even attempt an Asian American type of story, even if it was in English. It just felt like I just knew like that wasn't something that I should put a lot of energy into because my odds of success were going to be pretty low. So, so I think that has been the biggest change in the last 20 years. Like I remember when Old Boy came out, and director Park, back then was such a trailblazer. But again, it's like, how do you translate that, into mainstream media? That's something that has taken a lot more time and convincing. And for sure, you just sort of accept that you're not going to find a role model or mentor who's like you. I think that's one of the important things I had to come to grips with very quickly is like, if I was going to be successful, I was going to have to find people who would connect with me and champion me who didn't look anything like me. And I'd have to win their trust and their respect in a different way than if I was packaged differently. I mean, you're just aware that there are different obstacles. But in the end, I don't think I thought too hard about it. And I always tell people, I think if someone asked me what's been harder, being a woman or being Korean American, I would say probably being a woman part has been the harder. The sexism is almost more difficult to overcome than necessarily some sort of unconscious bias based in race.
Wow. Wow, I didn't know that. I guess you speaking on it, in the last 20 years, even in your workplace, do you feel encouraged by new trends, like especially on TV with a Parasite? People love kimchi now, K-pop. But are you encouraged, like in your workplace, do you see more diversity as well as on the screen?
It's a good question. I'd say overall, yes, there's greater diversity in the business, but it's taken slow and steady kind of pace. It has not been like a radical change overnight. And even with George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, I think the reality is the pace of change takes a lot longer because what you really need to shift are the decision makers who have often been in the business like 30, 40 years. And that has not, if you look at like the major movie studios, there's only one that's run by a woman.
Wow.
And I don't think any of them are run by a person of color that I can think of the majors. So that just tells you, and then on the television side, yeah, there aren't a lot of, super senior people who have the power to really say yes to something, especially something risky, that usually means something that's more inclusive, that would, that comes from a non-majority background. So it's trending in the right direction, but I feel like there's still a lot of resistance in some ways to kind of walking the walk. Like people are all about hiring a diversity and inclusion officer. That seems to be like the new job of the year. But whether or not that person has any power to actually change the way decisions get made is to be seen. And I think the other thing that you can't ignore is the country is very polarized. And so while half the country, one might think, is really embracing this idea of equity and inclusion, I would argue there's another substantial portion of the country that feels like that's not necessarily the right priority of all the different things a company should be worried about, because for the most part, most of these companies are publicly traded or part of a publicly traded conglomerate. There's an enormous amount of pressure for earnings. And as a result, you can't make programming that feels too niche, right? It has to, especially as we move into a streaming world where you have these global players like Netflix and Amazon, the emphasis becomes global appeal. And in a way, it can help if the global audience is also more receptive to diverse actors and diverse stories, but it can also backfire, right? If it feels like, oh, well, the only bankable actors of color are X, Y, and Z, and if you don't have one of those three, then it's not going to work outside the U.S. I mean, that was often a conversation for many years in the movie studio that a lot of people probably weren't aware of, is that documentaries, animated films, and films that were basically like not with like recognizable white actors, there's a different financial calculation about what they'll do. So across the globe. And one of the big shifts in the movie business in particular, people ask, like, why are there endless Marvel movies, DC comic movies, right, over and over? It's because those movies do better internationally than the US. And the theatrical markets have always been growing more steadily and more extensively, whereas the US market was pretty mature, right? So that's why Black Panther, I think, is kind of a awesome sort of, magical unicorn of a movie, because it worked, and it worked everywhere. And Crazy Rich Asians is similar, but not quite the same, because interestingly, it didn't work as well as they thought it would in Asia, because in Asia it wasn't as novel, right? They make Asian movies with lots of Asian characters. There's nothing novel about that. And it was kind of more of an Asian American character as opposed to an Asian character. So, but that's kind of the global forces at work in terms of, are things getting better or worse? It's like they're getting better, but they could be getting better faster.
Wow. Okay. That's great to know. And I want to kind of segue, this is a perfect segue to questions that people submitted beforehand. To flesh out that idea a little bit more, we have someone who's curious, what is happening in the industry right now to encourage diversity and inclusion, specifically for Asian and Asian American storytelling?
So I would say there's essentially 3 or 4 buckets of entities in Hollywood that are all trying to do different initiatives to promote both people of color and specifically Asian Americans. The first bucket I would start with the guilds. So for example, the Directors Guild just announced this week a bunch of short film awards that are, for Black, Latinx, and Asian American filmmakers. And the idea is, I think, to give these students some support and ability to continue to make movies. So the guilds in general, I think, are trying harder to figure out how to help. Then there are nonprofit organizations, there's one called CAPE, the Coalition of Asian Pacific Folks in Entertainment. There's sort of an informal group of Korean American leaders in Hollywood that's formed. And what we do is we are trying to network with each other better to help each other succeed, as well as quickly identify Korean American talent in the community that we want to encourage. And then of course there's Gold House, which is an Asian American organization that is set to promote Asian American movies, whether it's on screen or it means that like the director or the writer were Asian American, and try to get them the biggest opening weekend box office possible. And this organization is underwritten by, among other people, one of the co-founders of Twitch, who like sold his company for like $500 million to Amazon. And so there's a lot of actual tech money kind of quietly sitting inside the Gold Open organization. So for example, Crazy Rich Asians, like what they did is they asked the members who could afford to do this to just buy out entire theaters and then like give away the tickets and then make sure that like that movie can get as close to number one, if not make number one that weekend, because the performance of that opening weekend determines how many screens that movie gets to stay on the following weekend. So there's that nonprofit bucket. Then, like I was saying earlier, all the networks and studios are doubling down on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and staffing. They're actually like building out departments of people. So for example, a friend of mine just got this job at Warner Media, and she was telling me there's this program that they're going to do where on one of these huge, big budget television shows, they're going to pick like a handful of people of color to mentor, and then they will get to like apprentice and follow the directors around the whole time. And then season 2, they'll each get to direct an episode, which is pretty cool. And they've made that commitment. So there's like, actual corporate efforts going on. And then you have things like Sundance, which I think is the Institute runs a lot of different labs to try to get folks who might not otherwise have resources to get mentors and figure out how to pitch a TV show, how to develop a movie script, how to develop a documentary. Like there's things like that. And the film schools, of course, are very aggressive. USC, NYU, UCLA, AFI, like all these places are very aggressive in supporting students of color. So Asian Americans really kind of fall in that bucket, I would say. And it really is the early stages. I still think there's a lot of work to be done.
Mm-hmm. Most certainly, most certainly. Someone is curious, how has the pandemic changed the film and entertainment industry? Maybe for the better, maybe for the worse.
Depends who you are.
Okay.
I would say it was during the pandemic that I think Netflix hit 200 million subscribers. So clearly all these subscription video on demand streaming services have had a huge bump, and those, some percentage of those people might cancel, but most of them will probably stick around. So it really puts ammunition into the war chests of the streaming services. And it really is kind of an arms race these days where people are trying to make these very expensive, exclusive deals, locking down big talent, whether it's writer or director or showrunner, so that they can't work with the other streamers. And then they, that's like Shonda Rhimes, at Netflix, or J.J. Abrams at HBO Max. Oprah Winfrey's got the deal at Apple TV. Like these are exclusive deals. They're multi-year. They're millions and millions of dollars. And so if you think about it, if you're the person running like CBS or ABC, this is not good for you, because the behavior and the money is headed in a different model. And even worse, I think, for basic cable channels where people are canceling their cable, but no one really thinks that they can live without their Netflix during the pandemic. So there's that, and then you have consumer behavior shifting. One of the biggest sort of brouhahas last winter was when Warner Media announced all their movies, Warner Brother movies for 2021 would go day and date in the theaters and on HBO Max. But the reality is, like, how else are people going to see them during a pandemic? But it begins to shift the consumer perception of what is a movie that I'm willing to get out of the house to go see. And I think that's scary to a lot of creators and traditional movie studio execs for good reason. But on the other hand, if you want to keep the business going, you have to try this, because you can't hold on to all these movies, right? And wait. Like, who knows when everyone's going to feel comfortable going back to the cinema. So I think that's also changing, is what is the definition of a theatrical feature? Used to be very clear cut, now is a little bit fuzzy. And I would argue, like, when you look at the numbers, having a movie come out on a global streaming platform, is that more or less eyeballs than if you had it come out in movie theaters first? Like, right? Because you got to think about that. As an artist, you want the most people to see your work. So I think the pandemic has really pushed all of that. And then the unfortunate part of it has been everyone's been out of work for the most part. And so it's been very difficult for new people to get a foothold into the business. That's what I've seen a lot of, unfortunately. And that, I think, is going to take a little bit of time to ramp back up.
That's great. This is a fun question. What do you think of the diversity cast in the period drama Bridgerton? And do you see it as some kind of a trend?
It's a good question. I mean, I would say in general, more than ever, Hollywood is very mindful, I would say, of thinking about how to cast in a way that's authentic and inclusive, especially as you hear about, like, people are like, well, they don't, if somebody is gay, can't they find a great gay actor to play that role? Like, I think but there's also the feeling of like, well, is it always the default person is a white male to play that role? Like, think more broadly. So, but again, it's been a long time coming. Like, I'm sure some of you might have read last month that Daniel Day Kim, after 31 years of being an actor, is finally going to have a lead show.
Oh my God.
Kind of like, that's kind of crazy that it's taken him 3 decades to convince someone that he can handle being the lead.
Oh my God.
So yeah, I mean, I think in general, yes, there will be hopefully more openness to, like, having non-majority folks take lead roles, because I think that's what really matters, is like, are we in the center of the story? Are we the star, not just the supporting sidekick? And I think the period thing is a little bit of a separate issue. There is surprisingly, I think, a resurgence of period dramas coming into focus, like The Crown and Bridgerton and Queen's Gambit, and those are all period things. And then there's The Great on Hulu, and I think part of it has been a dearth of making that kind of stuff on broadcast TV, right? Because who could afford it? Like, period is very expensive. So part of that, going back to the money thing, it's like, well, if the streamers are concentrating the wealth with the subscription dollars, then they are more likely to be able to make lush period pieces. And then in turn, if the audience continues to reward that kind of programming, then it's a virtuous circle, and they'll just keep making more of it.
Wow. All right, let's segue a little bit to the industry a little bit more. So what sparked your interest in the field of media producing, and how much creative control do producers usually have on projects?
Well, I mean, I think I sort of answered the first time about how did I get into it. It's like, I was a bit of an avant-garde actor, and then I was really passionate about independent movies, and went to film school to be an exec at an independent studio, and actually miraculously got that job eventually. And then from there, I became more curious about the larger picture and the business generally. So that's kind of what led down all the other paths that followed after Searchlight. And then in terms of, the second half of the question, which is, what was it? The second half?
Yeah, how much creative control do producers usually have on projects? Yeah.
All right, that's the it depends answer, right? It depends. In film, it depends. Are you making an independent movie, or are you making a movie inside the studio system? If you're making a movie inside the studio system, then the studio 9 times out of 10 will have final cut. So you have influence, especially if you're like a huge movie star doing something at a cut rate discount or something because it's your passion project. But if you're like the 4th or 5th producer on like a huge movie that has like a gigantic producer at the head of it, then like you're probably not going to have as much power. If you're indie producer, you have some power. Again, depends on how much experience and your reputation. But it also depends on how does your movie get financed. Because if somebody wrote you a big check, and the person who wrote the check, understandably, probably asked for a lot of control. So it depends. And then in television, it's even stickier because in TV, there's the TV studio and there's the TV network and there's the showrunner. So presumably if you yourself are not the showrunner and you're a non-writing producer, then you're just, it really depends on the nature of your relationships with all those other entities about how much clout do you have based on really like a prior working relationship with all those entities, right? If you are Chuck Lorre and you've made a bajillion hit shows for CBS, people are not going to mess with you. But if you are, you know, someone who's just starting out and it's your first TV show and they just paired you with someone more experienced, you're just not going to have as much clout as someone who has a long track record of success. So really the answer to that question is it depends. Oh, the only exception is if it's like your life story or something and you're like executive producing your life story. I mean, that's different because it's your life story. This is actually happening to a friend of mine. But in general, it's, you know, it's what's in the contract, and what you can negotiate in the contract is dependent on how much leverage you have in any given situation.
I'm curious then, what is like one of your shows that you've produced that you had a lot of creative control and say in the past?
Well, anything I did at Hulu, because we were the network, and in the world of TV, the television network has final cut. Although even that, I would argue, is there's a lot of gray area. Like there are certain shows that I did that we 100% financed as Hulu, and it was a relatively inexperienced showrunner, so there's a lot of sway. But then there's like the show we did with James Corden that was a co-finance deal with the BBC. There's not a ton of say. There's some say, but it's not as much as if we had financed it 100% ourselves. And then the shows that we do for Netflix's final say because they're the buyer. I have some influence because I'm also very close to the talent, and often, of course, the talent has a huge voice regardless of what the contract says. So if you're close to someone who has as much clout as Reese, and you're like representing her point of view, then obviously you have more clout than the average producer, right? Like, so that's why I say it all depends on who's involved and what is the pecking order, and then you'll know your relative power or not in that dynamic.
Got it. I'm just so curious. I'm sure our viewers are too. How is it like working on Hello Sunshine with Reese Witherspoon?
Oh, it's great. I mean, I don't work there anymore. I left about 8 months ago, but it was a great run for me. And I left more because my job description had really morphed quite a bit from what it started. But it was a interesting and very like impressive kind of experience seeing somebody of her caliber up close. I mean, she works incredibly hard. She's very smart. She reads all the time. She really produces as well as acts in the shows that you see her doing. Like she is like giving script notes and watching rough cuts and is very involved in the craft of making these shows. And then I think the other thing is, you know, it's relentless scrutiny. Like it's that whole feeling of you're always living in public and your projects have a little bit of a target on them, right? Because there's always going to be some haters out there. So you have to be confident that, you know, what you're doing is true to what you think the values of the company are, and not worry too much about the noise that's going to happen, like on social or whatever. But she's really impressive, and it really is a unique, I think, experience thus far for me professionally to work with someone who is at the pinnacle of Hollywood and kind of see the types of opportunities that come as a result of her position, but also see the kind of stakes, if that makes sense, that you have that are higher than most people because of how high profile she is. So you have to be more cautious, I would say, in terms of how you handle some of the information, how you handle the way the brand is displayed through the programming, if that makes sense. You want to make sure that everything is very consistent with her brand and with what the company stands for. Wow,
I didn't know that. That's very informative. Thank you. Oh, I love this question. This is so cute. Someone's curious, what two things do you make sure to do every single day?
Okay, let's see. Other than the basic stuff, well, about 5 years ago, I picked up Vedic meditation. So that
Oh,
is something
wow.
I do every morning. Um, and during the pandemic, I've really taken the time to try and do some kind of exercise every single day. Because I find as I get older, a lot of the clarity in decision making or the openness to new ideas is like strangely tied to like physically how flexible am I feeling and how strong am I feeling, and there's a true like mind body connection. So I actually do a lot of yoga, um, and trying to sort of, you know, be in a place where I can be receptive to new creative ideas, because I think that's one of the things that's really hard about the Hollywood lifestyle is like there's a lot of hustling and selling, and you can always be in motion, but
Mm,
often like the creative inspiration or um, the right response to something that someone is asking of you only happens if you can like be still for a bit. And so for me, like my daily practices have more to do with how to be still, if that makes sense.
that makes a lot of
Um,
sense.
and that has been, I mean, I'm sure it's going to be like a lifelong sort of struggle. I mean, I was joking with someone, I said I now understand the theories of reincarnation, because to achieve the kind of like Buddhist state that people talk about of, you know, I'm unperturbed, you know, my inner calm is never irritated by anyone or anything, I'm just like, that would take like 17 lifetimes to practice, to really just like never be pissed when someone cuts you off in traffic, right? Like never want to lash out at someone who like you discover they've lied to you about something at work, or have just like not done something that they said they were going to do and now you're left holding the bag. Like to get that kind of equanimity, I'm just like, oh man, yeah, that's why reincarnation conceptually makes sense, because it's a constant practice. And I don't think I even was aware until I started meditating that like that even existed, if that makes sense. That like trying to be in that state of mind was like a real destination that I might occasionally visit.
I love that. Yeah, I definitely believe in reincarnation, especially because it's going to take me a while to get to that inner peace. Someone's curious, why did you start Hulu Originals?
Well, I can't take sole credit for it, I should say first. When I joined Hulu, it was only 250 people. To put into perspective, it is now more than 10 times that size. And they were just beginning to move away from the PC based ad only. If you remember, they first started only on your computer, only with ads. So they're moving to subscription. And there's basically two things that make you subscribe, right? One is, well, really three. One is it can't be too expensive. Two is like there has to be something exclusive there that you can't get somewhere else, that seems like you have to see it or else you won't be part of a cultural conversation. And
Mm,
three, there has to be like lots of other content there. So once you finish watching the thing that everyone's buzzing about, there's like still reason for you to not cancel the subscription. And so what that means is like when Hulu started, it was just taking other people's stuff and putting it on. But then once it wanted to charge for subscription, it needed to have stuff that was just theirs. And then you start looking at the cost of like acquiring something exclusively. So let's say you want to be the exclusive home of Family Guy or Breaking Bad or whatever. Quickly, the competition starts to mount. And before you know it, the licensing cost per episode is the same as if you went off and made your own show. So that's why
wow.
all the streamers went into originals. Because at some point, it's like, are you really going to pay Sony, the studio that made Breaking Bad, $1 million an episode to license it? Or are you, which will only let you have the license for like, let's say 3 years? Or are you just going to basically spend $1 million and make your own TV show that you totally control, right? That becomes the math. And that you own forever, as opposed to the licensing model, which is like you're kind of renting it. So that was why they were like originally like, okay, we need to do our own programming. And the other reason, of course, is you need a brand identity, right? Like you need to, like people know, especially in the early days, like everyone knew House of Cards was on Netflix. And that was like the thing. And then everyone knew that Handmaid's Tale was on Hulu. And then people know that Transparent was on Amazon. Like these hit shows often define like what is this platform and what is the brand of this platform. And so that's the other reason why they're like, let's do originals. So when I came in, we didn't have a lot of money. I always joke that like one episode of House of Cards is like my entire budget for like a year and a half there. And we had a lot of passionate viewers of very niche-y kind of things. So they liked anime, they liked adult animation, they liked half-hour comedies like The Office, they watched documentary films. So we built like a very modestly budgeted but interesting like filmmaker-driven slate of originals. So the first slate of originals were all kind of in, if you look at it, they're all in those buckets. So like half-hour comedy, there's an animated one which we did with Seth Meyers and Mike Shoemaker and the whole cast of SNL voice cast it. There's a docu-series about mascots that it has a comedic but very heartfelt tone to it. So that was the original intention behind like why, you know, not only Hulu got into originals, but why all the streamers eventually had to get into it.
That's fascinating. Let's look at some Q&As. We have one here. You mentioned international distribution potential as a criterion for whether or not something gets greenlighted. How does this generally get assessed? And is there a hierarchy of markets that are valued, China, Europe, etc., or can international strategies be more niche?
All right. So this is a complicated question because the answer I think is different based on are you distributing films or are you distributing TV? And let's talk about this in those two categories first. So since I would argue in the late 90s for films, as more and more international markets came online and it became apparent that Americans were really good at exporting our blockbuster movies because frankly, only American studios have the money to make these crazy $200 million films, right? Like it's very difficult for even the Europeans to do that. And their tradition is not that type of film, right? For them, the cinema has been really, frankly, more of an art than a business. So, so when you build what they call the ultimate model, which is if you think about it, it's like the valuation model for a movie. And like how much money will this movie make over the lifetime when it's in theaters, on DVD back in the day, or it's a streaming deal on iTunes. Used to be in the old days as, you know, pay cable, free TV. So you're looking at the arc of that. And one of the secrets in the film business that most people don't talk about is one of the biggest windows that make money for movies is international pay television. So it's that first window after it's come out of the movie theater. And it's like the equivalent, if you think about it, of an HBO, Showtime, Stars type service, but in some of the major markets. And in film, the old days, you know, the acronym is FIGS plus Japan, were like basically what matters. France, Italy, Germany, Spain, the UK, and then the English-speaking world. UK, Japan, and then Australia-ish, although it's only 25 million people. And then eventually it would, you know, expand beyond there. But those were like the major markets back in the day for film, and probably to a certain extent still are. And then on the TV side, if it's scripted, we'll just stick to scripted because unscripted is a whole other animal. The international value matters more to streamers. And so the hierarchy of markets depends on where that streamer's international footprint is strongest. So it varies. Like for someone like Netflix, it's like, well, where are their international markets growing the quickest? Is it like Brazil? You know, so it's hard to answer this question as a blanket statement. It probably depends on the platform. Or if you're like a television studio, like Warner Brothers, again, it depends like where are their pre-existing distribution deals. If they're distributing outside the US, Is it going through like HBO Scandinavia in some cases, or are they like using a third-party sales agent? Like, it really depends. But I will say one of the things that is driving global services are, you'll see there's a lot more dramas, right? Because comedy is a culturally specific thing. Like what Americans think is funny, Germans don't necessarily think is funny, the Japanese don't necessarily think is funny. So that's the other reason why you'll see in television, ever since the streamers came on board and they have all these global ambitions, they're much more likely to choose dramatic types of stories. And then finally, the other piece that has been driving the change is pre-awareness of intellectual properties. So whether that is like a blockbuster book, like the Da Vinci Code back in the day, or a Marvel superhero, something like that can really change the profile of a project and have people extrapolate, oh, this is going to do well overseas. And I think a lot of this too, if you think about it, is the basic math of like, how big is the market? How well developed is the theatrical or television distribution thing? How much local competition is there, right? Because if you're like making TV and you're hoping to distribute in England, well, the UK makes a ton of amazing TV through their own systems. So that might be trickier than trying to like sell your television show to Australia, right? Like it's all about the market dynamics. And you can be, there's a question about, can it be more niche? It can be more niche, but then it means you have to scope your project down budget-wise to actually satisfy the financial projections.
I'm curious, in the last 20 years, have you seen a different, like which markets have gotten bigger? Like I'm sure Korea and China have gotten a lot bigger, and maybe the European countries are quelling. I don't know, I'm curious.
Well, China is like its own animal. So China has a quota for how many movies a year they will take from the US.
Wow.
And in China, you get less than 50% of the box office take. Way less, actually, because you have to pay off the Chinese Film Corporation. So, so there's a quota. They also do not like stuff that is not culturally consistent in supporting their view. Like they don't even like movies where you have Russians as villains because they're communists. And so you have to rewrite the whole thing.
Wow.
And I have seen and worked on movies where there's like the ending for the Chinese audience. So there's a lot of censorship for reals that goes on. And so it's very difficult to make a lot of profit, even though it is the largest single market with content with China.
Wow.
That being said, if you can figure out a really clever co-pro arrangement where you can actually work with someone based in China, that can sometimes be interesting. And I'm seeing a lot more of that, right? And there's a lot of Chinese money obviously floating around Hollywood. So, but yeah, China's kind of its own animal. It's like people are making money, but the question is who? And then the growth has echoed a lot of, as you would imagine, like where population and GDP continue to grow most aggressively. So Europe remains like a robust market, but then unsurprisingly, I would guess like I know Amazon is, from what I hear, investing significantly in like Brazil. And then I think Netflix has invested significantly in like India. So it's like, you know, the BRIC companies, right? It's like Brazil, Russia, India, China, like there is some subset of that probably is the more growth component part, but then you're also bumping up against the language issue, the local culture issue, and in some cases, the content censorship issue.
Wow. And to follow up to that question, with streaming television becoming more and more powerful and global, is America...
is American parochialism
coming to an end?
Coming to an end.
Is Parasite, for instance, a beginning of an end? Ooh.
Well, the problem is these are all American companies. I think that's what makes it hard, is like Netflix, Disney Plus, Apple, HBO Max, like all these streaming services, those are all American companies run by Americans. So I don't know if this is really the beginning of the end. I think the only way that happens is if the audience pressures these companies and behaves in a way that says like, we're not interested in just American stories. what was that hit that was on Netflix recently from Spain? Oh my goodness, I can't remember it now. But that I thought was interesting that young people were watching it. It was subtitled Casa de Papel. That's what it was. And I just thought like, well, that's awesome that like young people are watching things in Spanish with subtitles, because when I was 19, I guess I watched some, but I don't know if I would have watched a whole season of TV. But like you have to have more of that. Parasite to me, it's like a perfect movie that was made at the perfect time when income inequality is a different kind of global pandemic, frankly. But it's not replicable, if that makes sense. Like you can't aim for that again. So I do think that it would be different if we also all subscribe to some streaming service that started in Japan. But the reality is like Americans are the ones with the capital, the technology, the resources, the long history, the pipeline into Hollywood. Like Americans are set up to dominate. And if we don't want that to happen, then global audiences have to demand different kinds of content.
Wow. They're still in charge. Okay, so we have another question. If you're just starting out and you want to sell a script for a film or an idea for a TV show, what are the first steps you have to take? I'm curious about this too.
All right, well, one is it's very helpful to have some kind of representation. Can be a lawyer, can be a manager, can be an agent, but somebody who has a bit of a track record and frankly has probably clients who are more established than you are, and can actually help you launch into the sort of clubbiness of our business. So I think if you're a writer, an actor, or director, you need to actually be very entrepreneurial, write as much as you can, make as many short videos as you can on your own to create a body of work that would convince a representative to take you on. That's one path. The other path, which I forgot to mention earlier, is, especially if you want to be a writer, several studios offer diversity writing programs where they are actively looking and will do a year mentorship and then will place you for a year into a writer's room on a show. So I've had one friend who she was placed on Lost. I had another friend who was placed into Grey's Anatomy, and both these women are Korean American, and they were both able to both find representation and their next job as a result of being part of these diversity writer programs. So you just have to do research, but they do exist. And then I think the other piece of it is, look, film is different. If you're trying to make a small indie movie, your odds are higher. I think that you can sort of do it out of the gate by sheer like hustle. But television is like this massive team sport, right? Because if you're going to make a season of TV, it's always a huge investment, and nobody makes TV speculatively without knowing there's a distribution partner involved, which means that there's a network involved, whether that's a streamer or traditional broadcast network or cable network. So then the way I look at it, based on where the industry is now going, when I was talking earlier about exclusive content is what streamers want, what you're seeing is this verticalization of the business. And what I mean by that is, like in the old days, there's a Fox TV studio and there's a Fox network. There's an ABC TV studio and there's an ABC network. So back in the old days, the studios would just sell to whoever wanted to buy the show. So for example, Modern Family, everybody thinks about that as a show that is, a show that is on, was that Fox, right? That was a Fox show. But I think the studio was ABC. Wow. And that's what people don't realize is there used to be much more fluidity where like people were making things for not necessarily their sister network. They would just sell it and flip it around and figure it out. So, but now, because almost every entity now has a streaming service, right? It's like the whole Warner Brothers TV empire is basically like making it for the Warner Brother networks, whether that's the Turner networks, whether that is the CW, whether that's going to be HBO Max or HBO, and so then those folks are all making exclusive deals with talent, right? Then if you're a newbie, you really are lucky if you can hook up with one of those established talent that has an overall deal, right? This is how Lena Dunham got Insecure made. You see this pairing, right? Lena was partnered with Judd Apatow. All, you know, at that point, all she had was Tiny Furniture, but she was, you know, she was paired with one of the most successful kind of comedic showrunners of the time. And then that shepherded the whole thing into making a pilot, and a pilot that got shot to series, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the other thing that I think you can pursue in tandem with the representation and the writer's program and all that other good stuff, is like, can you figure out a way, and you have to do a ton of research of, is my project a fit for one of these really heavyweight people in Hollywood, or Steven Yeun, the Minari guy, like he just signed a deal with Amazon Studios. So if you had something that you felt was really his sensibility, is there a way for you to get that to his reps or to him? And would he want to take it through into his Amazon deal? Because these deals, you know, they are multi-year expensive deals that not only pay salaries to not only the star, but like usually their assistant, and there's an executive, and the executive has an assistant, there's an expense account, there's office space, there's furniture for the office. Like, so they've invested, right? So they want to say yes to the people they've done the overall deals with. So, and because we're all building these factory silos again. So that's the kind of thing that I always tell people: think hard, and then finally do your research and make sure that what you are proposing is really original. That it hasn't been done before, or it's been done before and it failed. If that's the case, why is yours going to be different? But really know the marketplace, and then know the buyers, and know that like, oh, this network is really looking for true crime, but they don't really want like, you know, cheap action or horror. This network really wants a filmmaker auteur driven concept. This network seems to buy a lot of pre-existing IP, like projects based on books. Like, you really have to understand the market, and then constantly be like trying to do a match between what you're trying to make and then the people that you'll need to get that made, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Wow. That's fascinating about the Steven Yeun thing. Like, of course they want that year-long deals. It's like being on salary at a corporate job. People, especially artists, want that stability and consistency. Fascinating. We have some great questions in the Q&A. Someone's wondering, given all of the current pressure for immigration reform, is this a theme that you can see the television industry, if not the film industry, expanding upon?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think the television industry is interested in good drama. So any original, smart telling around the theme of immigration could be of interest, because it is a setting where there can be a lot of high stakes. And that's the other thing I'll say is, like, if you look at the shows that do well, they're kind of two extremes. They're either like dramas where like it could be the end of the world or everyone's going to die, right? They're high stake, big world dramas. Or they're like a lot of like fluffy escapist, like the Bridgerton kind of thing. That's sort of like an elevated soap. Or even like Downton Abbey, right? People always said like that's like the Dallas of our times, because like we're all like so like starved to like see opulence and know that these, you know, snooty people are really deeply flawed. So but like the immigration space, it's like it's high stakes, it's big drama. I think what you're going to struggle with there is like nuance and relatability, and not having it come across as like a TED talk about policy. And making sure that people are surprised, you know, about how the story unfolds, or the new angle that you're going to give on it that people haven't seen before. That's always a good litmus test of whether or not your thing is working, by the way. It's like, have we seen this before?
Yeah, recycling. Great. We have another question. Do you have any advice for recent undergrads trying to get their foot in the entertainment industry, especially as a Korean American?
Well, the Korean American piece I think is only useful if like you're really actually an expert in Korean culture, right? Like people, like I'll give you an example, like Pachenko is being made by Apple TV into a miniseries. And we had like in our like Korean American community, people are like, we need a PA who's bilingual and who has some experience being on set and who can like translate between like the cast and the director and the producer and blah, 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 blah. And so I feel like my Korean is terrible, but I feel like seriously, if you're bilingual and like you can broker conversations between like K-pop talent or Korean acting talent, directing talent, and what's going on in Hollywood, like for definitely lean into that skill. I mean, there's a Chinese American producer, Janet Yang, who is considered kind of the godmother of Asian American producers in Hollywood. Like she is,
Oh, wow.
she's like legendary. And to be fair, like reading about her in Harper's Bazaar in 1997 was one of the reasons why I came into the business. Cause I was like, look, Asian woman who like, you know, went to Brown and got an MBA at Columbia and like basically got her foot in the door because she speaks Mandarin, is very bright, and she worked with Steven Spielberg on Empire of the Sun.
Oh my God. Okay.
And to this day, she still leveraged her heritage. Like she produced the Chinese version of High School Musical for Disney. So like, that's what I'm saying. Like if you've got the language skills and you understand K-pop and the Hallyu and like the wave of Korean culture, by all means, like there's definitely like stuff for you. Now, if you're like me and you don't know any of those things and the language skill is not there, then I think it's a little bit different because then you've got to figure out, like someone gave good advice the other day at this other panel, like they were like, you should figure out what is your personal brand. Like in other words, it's not good to just go to a job and be like, I love everything and I can work on any kind of project, because generally that means that you don't know yourself very well and what you're really passionate about. So you need to kind of imagine if you were creating yourself as a new product that's going into the grocery store. Like what are you? What kind of product are you? What would your marketing message be? What would your packaging look like? Because that's essentially what you're doing when you're trying to like send out a resume or like ask someone to take you on as an intern. I mean, the COVID times have made it very difficult for paid internships. So if people can financially swing it, I mean, I think now is the time to like offer to do like internships for school credit and not get paid. And then I think the other thing is like read the trades and understand where the money is going, right? Like it's not, the pain of the pandemic is not spread out equally. Like now would probably be a terrible time to go look for an internship in a movie studio because the movie studios are all in trouble because they haven't been able to put people in the theater. Probably a great time to figure out how many overhead deals does Netflix, Amazon, Apple, like who have they made all these deals with? And I guarantee you there's like at least 100 companies in town, at least they've done deals with. And out of those people, who could you help the most? Who do you have the strongest creative overlap, connection, affinity for? Because then you have something to offer them, right? Like the most compelling letters to me are the ones where they clearly know who I am, they clearly know my taste and what I've worked on, and they are very clear about what they have to offer me. And that's the kind of person that I'm going to take a shot at, because I'm like, oh, I don't have to like worry that this person won't be motivated because they already clearly have enough self-motivation to have done all this work so far.
That's fascinating. Let's see. Okay, so this is kind of calling back to a previous question and answer you had. How are companies trying to enter the India market with so many languages and intense regionalism? It would seem really complicated.
I don't know that much about it. I just know that like there have been articles reporting about, I think it's Netflix. I think that's right. In general, I'll speak more generally, more broadly about the trend. Like as we talk about like trying to keep, 100 to 200 million global subscribers happy, most companies have had to think about a certain level of in-country investment. In other words, you can't always expect them to like want to look at our stuff and read subtitles or hear dubbing. You're going to have to like invest in the local community, in the local production community, and actually commission content from there, or co-finance with other entities. So my guess would be that in a place like India, it's probably not dissimilar, where you're going to scope out the landscape, figure out the market sizing, take into account all the different fragmentation lines, whether it's language or cultural, and then figure out like, is it more efficient for me to like partner with someone who's already in the market so that I can like help finance them and accelerate what they're doing, or broaden the number of projects they're doing? Or is it such a big market that I think I understand well enough or can hire people in that market who understand it, and I'm going to put my own footprint in there and just like create my own thing. I mean, I was laughing because I think it was yesterday or today, like Ted Sarandos finally announced that like Netflix is opening an office in Canada. Like, because I guess like until now they just did production up there to take advantage of all tax credits. But like there's never actually been like a Netflix office with a local development executive
Wow.
who's commissioning Canadian content. So it just depends. Just depends.
Wow, I didn't know it took them so long.
Yeah.
Another question, back to what you were referencing before, because vertical integration is going on, like for instance, Amazon and Apple is producer, distributor, theater, and a lot more, even manufacturer of projection system, do you feel that the court will step in at some point and try to break it up?
It's an excellent question because, of course, we know this is what happened in the middle of the 20th century with the studios, right? Because they own the theaters and then it was an antitrust thing. I think it's a bigger question now based on competition. And so I think the hard challenge of trying to break them up is that there's so many of them. So it's hard for the government to argue that it's an anti-competitive kind of verticalization because there's like 7 of them. Well, really more, like 10. So as long as there's not like a throttling, like the biggest place where it could throttle and it has not happened, and I don't expect it to happen, is most of these streaming services, the whole back end of the traffic runs on Amazon Web Services, right? So like if, and I don't think they're doing this, but like if Amazon was like anti-competitive and like accelerated the Amazon Prime Video traffic above the data packets from like Netflix or Apple or whatever, then you have a problem on your hands. But that's not going to happen because they know that's going to cause a problem, and there's really no reason for them to do that. So I do think there is a danger of everyone wanting just globally, broadly appealing stuff. Like my fear is more that like niche stuff might get lost because these tech companies are all about scale. I'm more concerned about that than like, oh, there's all these vertically integrated things with the government. Is until there's only like 2 or 3 of them left, then it's a different conversation. And then they each charge you like $200 per subscription because you have nowhere else to go. I mean, I think once you get there, we will have huge problems, but I don't think it's going to get there.
Okay, good. I'm hopeful. Great. And I think one of our last questions, with the current COVID-19 climate, what can students do to increase their chance of employment in the industry?
Let's see. Depends what you want to do in the business. So let's start with the creators. Like if you want to act, director, right, then you should be using this time, if you can, to like be really productive. Like either, if you're a writer, write a lot of different scripts, whether that's for representation, whether you already have representation, you're trying to get staffed on a show, like whatever it is. But like if you're an actor, like whether it's a 1-person show or 2-person show or some sort of COVID safe kind of like, but I think you kind of have to use this quiet time to like percolate, develop ideas and get ready for when pretty much the doors are all open again. But I think as creators, as much as you can create during this time, the better. And that practicing the craft, of course, never goes away. I think if you want to be a business person, like an executive of any kind, development exec, marketing person, social media exec, that type of thing, then I would argue it's a great time to be reading books about the business. It's a great time to be like spending a lot of time, reading articles, watching interviews of execs who are in your line of work. Because the reality is what we're doing today, a lot of people are doing. So there's like more online content than ever, I feel like, where you can like educate yourself about like, I want to do X. And then you can like Google and just look at videos of, the senior vice president of X from, Paramount is talking about blah, blah, blah. So I think using that time to educate yourself and really working on like, again, it goes back to like, what is my personal brand? What am I really about? Like, this is the time to kind of crystallize that message for yourself, because it doesn't matter what you want to do in our business. Everybody has to be really good at pitching themselves.
Mhm.
So you might as well use this time to like get that down.
Yeah, trying every day. Great. I kind of want to end on an encouraging note. In our previous conversation, you shared a story about your Stanford alumni interviews. And I was hoping you could kind of share what you saw as a trend in a lot of the females you interviewed.
Oh God, that's right. You remember. Okay,
I do
so
remember.
so I do volunteer. I've been suckered into volunteering like so many other alums in interviewing these poor, hapless high school seniors, and for the undergraduate admissions office. And let me first state, by the way, that like they tell us right away, like we don't really care about your opinion about whether or not you think the student should go in. Like you're just there for the student to have access to an alum to chat to, and then if you have anything interesting to tell us, let us know. But they pretty much tell you from the beginning, like you don't really matter that much in the admissions process, but you should chat with them. And I had this experience where, and I don't know if this is on purpose or on accident, but I get paired with a lot of students from non-majority backgrounds, and inevitably that means living in Southern California, a certain percent of them are Asian American kids. And in particular, I get these Asian American young women who inevitably sit down and start the conversation saying they really want to be pre-med.
Mm.
And then they ask me what I do for a living. And then I tell them that I like went to film school and I like produce television and I used to work in movies. And then all of a sudden, like, they go, well, actually, what I really want to do is architecture, or what I really want to do is art history, or what I really love to do is like, you know, ice skating or whatever. And it always makes me, I'm always like super conflicted because, you know, part of me wants to be like, well, then you should do that. If that's what you really want to do, you don't want to be pre-med. But then I also don't want them to go home to their parents and be like, you know, the Stanford lady says I should just do what I want, you know, and cause like family strife. Like it's a really difficult position. So I'm very, how shall I put this? Like circumspect, you know, they're not asking me for advice, right? So I'm just telling them like, well, you know, college is about figuring that kind of stuff out and just leaving it there. But I do think there is a lack of cultural history for the immigrants' children, right? Like if you are in Korea today, it's so different because pop culture and being a K-pop star, being an actor is seen as a super prestigious, cool thing to do. But like the Koreans who came over in the 60s and 70s, like they were still living in that value system of like scholarship and professors were at the pinnacle of social hierarchy. And entertainers, as my parents, you know, mentioned to me, was like, you know, second from the bottom. Like it was just sort of like you did that because you weren't good at school, you know, that was sort of the thinking. And and it's hard because immigrant parents, unless they are unusually well assimilated, they don't necessarily understand that jobs in entertainment have an enormous potential to have impact on society, right? And that particularly as a woman, as a person of color, as a gay person, as a trans, like that if you can exert your perspective, it can really change people's lives. And I will tell you, like one of my favorite stories from Reese is that after she made Legally Blonde, and Elle Woods, by the way, remains, I think, one of the most iconic characters she's ever played. So many young women over the last like 20 years since that movie came out have come up to Reese and said, I went to law school because of that movie. And because I thought lawyers would be like hard and like not feminine. And you showed that I could like be smart and have a great manicure and still go to Harvard Law. And like, and she also told us about how when she did jury duty, like the other jurors picked her to be the foreperson. And she's like, you know, I'm not a lawyer and I didn't go to law school and that was just a movie, but it didn't matter. Like she was such a brilliant Elle Woods that like that character became a real person for as far as anyone else was concerned, right? And
Wow.
so like, I think that that's kind of what this is about for us is that you don't want to overthink it. It's just having the courage to pursue this type of career that is essentially based on a type of self-expression and an exploration of identity that includes your Korean Americanness that in and of itself is like a trailblazing type of existence. And just the fact that you exist is in and of itself like an achievement. And I didn't really understand that even in my own small way until 2000, I don't know, like 11. I hired a woman who had graduated my same MFA program, but probably like 8 years, 9 years after me. And I didn't remember her, but she came up to me and she said, I just want you to know my 2 years of my MFA, you were the only Asian woman guest speaker we had. And seeing you made me understand that maybe I had a shot at being successful in our business. And I was so horrified because part of me, I don't know if it's because I was raised in the Midwest and, you know, there never were a lot of Asian people. So it never occurred to me that I would have to look for it. But even for me, right, that Harper's Bazaar article about Janet Yang made a huge difference in like what I thought was possible. And I just didn't know that like 12, 13 years after that moment, I would have that moment with this person who ended up working for me, like that she would remember that. The one time I showed up on a Wednesday night for class was the thing that made her feel a little more confident that this was going to work out. So I just feel like that's when people ask like, well, how are things going to change? I'm like, well, it's certainly not going to change if you just sit around waiting for other people to change it for you. Like if you want it to change, then you have to go in and do the work. I mean, it's, someone said to me recently, they go, it's only by hard things that you can change. And I think that applies to situations. Like growth comes, but it's not comfortable for anybody. And you have to be okay with being in really uncomfortable situations all the time if you want to have stuff get better. It's in other words, like it's kind of anti-intuitive. It's like things get better when you feel worse. If that makes sense. In the short
That's
term,
true.
you'll
Right.
feel better in the long term, but in the short term, it's like a really horrible deep tissue massage where you're like squirming, and you're just like, it'll be fine tomorrow, but it doesn't feel really good today. Like that's how this thing works. I've learned, and it's like you have to believe that like it's worth it. You can't keep questioning it every day. Because let me tell you, my parents were questioning it every day. I always change the subject. I'm like,
No, you're good. That was
let's
awesome.
not talk about my work.
That was brilliant. I promised you that this was going to be 80-minute event, and you know we're just running up against that. But Charlotte, I mean you're on fire. There's so much stories you're sharing with us, and I'm so grateful to get all these insights. I was wondering. This is the last question I've had.
Hello.
The last question I had, because you talked about your avant-garde background, and that was sort of a transition kind of a thing to the film. Was there ever a moment where you would actually sat through in a movie theater and said, "This is it. This is the reason why I'm gonna have to go back to film school," or was it just confluence of number of screenings that you were at?
No, I think the movie that really changed me, like really got me thinking, was the Coen brothers. They did that movie Barton Fink, where John Turturro was playing the writer.
Sure.
I think that movie and My Own Private Idaho. I mean, I came of age in my late teens at the height of the 90s indie movie movement, right?
River Phoenix, yeah.
Yeah, so like those movies, they were just really, and a part of it I'm sure is because I was like 18, 19 when I saw them, but they were just really profound. And they were like about something. It was not just like a caper. Not that I don't appreciate a good caper, but like I just felt like, well,
remember I read Marvel right here.
Yes, but the Marvel stuff I worked on the business side, right? I worked more on the business side, and I let the experts handle the creative, because the experts there have like 3,000 comics or more in their garage from when they were like 5. Like it's a whole other level of creative commitment there, which is why the product is so good. But I loved I loved auteur movies like Crouching Tiger. I remember seeing that in a movie theater and being like, oh my God, Asian people and like Ang Lee and the sort of mind blowingness of like how beautiful and cinematic it was. So yeah, there have been movies that have really excited me, but they tend to be the ones where it's like one person's singular vision. I also really love animation. Like Chicken Run is one of my favorite movies of all time, which is like totally different. But again, it's like very singular artistic vision. And I'm very attracted to that because I think avant-garde theater is very similar, right? It's this sort of uncompromising, this is not for everyone kind of theater. An independent film, it's like, it's not for everyone, but if it's for you, then it's really for you.
Great. Thank you. And I feel as if, we've held all these people hostage, despite the fact that there is, unfortunately, it's kind of a Zoom headaches going around, and everybody's suffering. There's, some kind of
I
virus.
understand.
That's coming out of Zoom. And my computer crashed twice today. When I was earlier in the Zoom. So again, thank you all of you for staying, and we had I had a hell of a time. So we can close the official recording of this.